What we're going to spend some time now on is generator status and then how to manage some of the waste in the different locations where it's stored. And now is where we're going to get to the question of why do we care about P-listed waste and what are all the issues and things to think about. So there are 3 types of generator status. The regulations, again, put you into 3 different buckets. We talked a lot about buckets for hazardous waste and whether it's hazardous or not. We're going to talk about 3 different buckets, 3 different categories of generators. If you generate any hazardous waste at all, what the level is of hazardous waste that you have to be thinking about. There are 3 categories. You can be a large quantity generator, a small quantity generator, or what is called a conditionally exempt small quantity generator. And we're going to talk about how you fall into the threshold for each of these. For each of them, the facility is considered separately, and a facility is generally contiguous property. So if, for example, Georgia Perimeter College, which I know is not here today, but has 4 different campuses considered within the umbrella of the one school, actually maybe more than 4, there are 4 that I know of. Each of those campuses is separated by about 10 miles from the other campus. The fact that administratively the system considers that to be one school doesn't matter. You take each campus individually and look at what's generated at that one campus. At the same time, if you have one campus, you cannot break it down and make each building a separate facility. What the regulations are trying to do is be reasonable but not allow you to do an end run around the regulations. So within reason, you've got to take a look at something that is contiguous property, and it's considered contiguous even if it's separated by a public way, as long as you generally continue to own property as you go along. If you suddenly are separated by a mile or 2 of property that somebody else owns, that's no longer contiguous space.
So if you're separate 2 campi, 1 athletic complex, you have to have 2 generator ID numbers?
Well, that would depend on the school. If you want to, you can always have 1 generator number. The EPA will never mind if you consolidate together. What they want to avoid is having you artificially divide things up so that you drop from one status down to a lesser regulated status. You can have 2 numbers if you want to, but you don't have to. If you are now under one ownership, then I think you may have to consolidate them into one, but that's something that's worth looking at and asking about. So what I want to do is quickly review the different types of categories and what makes you fall into each of the different categories. You will be a large quantity generator if in 1 month, any 1 month, you generate more than 1,000 kilograms of hazardous waste. You may have more than 1,000 kilograms of spill cleanup debris, or, this is another key issue, you have more than 1 kilogram of acutely hazardous, that P-listed waste. If the campus generates more than any of those thresholds for any 1 month, then you bump up and you're in a large quantity generator status. The question came up before, what if you are in that category, can you drop down? If you spike up once and then you drop down and you generally are going to generate less than 1,000 kilograms a month, but you spike up once, if it's a one-time shot, oftentimes the regulators won't even care about it. If you spike up once for a while and then you drop down, then they will consider you to be a large quantity generator for a while, but then you can always show them that you've dropped down again. So this is not permanent. It's not that once you bump up there once, you're fixed forever. It's month by month and year by year. But if you spike up at least twice a year, let's say, over a period of several years, if it looks like there's a pattern, then you're generally going to be considered to be in the category of the higher regulated entity. Also, it isn't just what you generate in a month, it's also what you store. If you store more than 6,000 kilograms at any time, or if you store more than 1 kilogram of P-listed waste at any time, then you also are going to be bumped up into that category. So it's either of those 2 conditions, what you generate in a month or what you store at any time. So again, that's why we focused a lot on that P-listed waste, because that all by itself much more likely to bump you up against the large quantity generator requirements than generating more than 1,000 kilograms a month for most campuses, or more than storing more than 6,000 kilograms a month. So that's why it's important.
It's a waste, not a process.
Absolutely, it's got to be a waste. We're only talking about waste here. We're not talking about useful product. You can have many pounds of what might become P-listed waste, but as long as it's still being used, we're not talking about that at all. You have to test the waste to make sure that it actually is considered to be a hazardous waste. So first you've got to show that it's actually a hazardous waste. If it is, then if the university is the owner of the project, then it's the university's waste. The contractor is taking it off for you, I don't believe is going to make a difference in terms of the regulations. Okay, so the university is still responsible for that. The next category, you've got large. The next category down is a small quantity generator. If in 1 month you generate between 100 kilograms and 1,000 kilograms, or if you generate between 100 kilograms and 1,000 kilograms of spill debris, and if you have less than 1 kilogram of acutely hazardous waste, then you are considered to be a small quantity generator. If you're between 100 and 1,000, then you're small. And again, if you bump up against any of these limits, then you're regulated as a large quantity generator, at least for a period of time. But if you can show that after a period of time you've stopped generating at that rate, then you can drop down to the lower category. So that's the second category. And the third category is what is called conditionally exempt. And these are locations where you don't generate more than 100 kilograms a month. You don't have more than 100 kilograms of spill debris, and you don't have more than 1 kilogram of acutely hazardous waste. All right? Also, you don't store more than 1,000 kilograms at any time, and you don't store more than 1 kilogram of P-listed waste. So for both conditionally exempt and small quantity generators, you want to try within reason to stay below those threshold limits, because as you'll see, the regulatory burdens keep going up. The higher the status from conditionally exempt to small to large, the more the regulations impose greater responsibilities and requirements on you. So at the end of the day, there may be nothing you can do, but where you have control, where the campus has control, you want to try to stay below those thresholds if you can. You have these 6-month chemical inventory reports. What does that help? Well, first, the thing to remember is that chemical inventory is focusing in on useful products. This is only focusing in on waste. Okay, this is only talking about how much waste you're generating. The second thing is, which we'll talk about in a minute, is every waste shipment should have a manifest with it. If you are a large or a small quantity generator, there has to be a document showing roughly how much waste you're generating. You use that as a quick, rough estimate to help you determine which category you're in. And again, we're talking about the distinction between chemical inventory, which is talking about useful product, and waste, which is talking about storing hazardous wastes. So this is only talking about waste, okay? It's only talking about storing hazardous waste. It's not talking about chemicals. It's got to be a waste before it even begins to get into this question. Okay, so that's a very important distinction to keep making. This entire regulatory scheme is only talking about waste. It's not useful chemicals. It's only waste. Okay? All right. So, what to think about when you're trying to determine if you're a generator, which generator category you might fall into, as an auditor, but also as a campus representative. Take a look at a year's worth of manifests, right? And then roughly divide by 12. If you've got more than 1,000 kilograms that are generated in 1 month, and the next month you've got more than 1,000 kilograms that get shipped out. I've got that backwards. If you've got a manifest that shows that you've got more than 1,000 kilograms that were shipped out, and you don't have a shipment that went out in the previous month, the assumption is that that waste was generated in the previous month, and so you end up getting bumped up. So one of the things you want to look for, both as an auditor but also as an auditee, as a regulated entity, to the extent you can, you've got either 90 days as a large quantity generator or 180 days as a small quantity generator. You can try to fix it so that in any given month, as a small quantity generator, you're trying to avoid bumping up over 1,000 kilograms that shows up on any given manifest. Again, you can only do so much, and if it means that you've got to ship out more than 1,000 kilograms at a time, that's what you ship out. But if you've got some discretion and you're still within the appropriate time periods, you can try to make sure that you don't bump up over 1,000 kilograms. Because generally what an auditor looks for, what an inspector from the agencies look for, is a manifest that shows over 1,000 kilograms in a given month. So where you have control, try to stay below that. If you cannot help it, then you're a large quantity generator, and that's what you are. But again, you're trying to see what you're looking for. So as an auditor, you're looking to see if you've got manifests that are fairly consistently at 1,000 kilograms or more. You're also looking very carefully at the amount of P waste that's manifested. And again, we talked about this before. Try to make sure that the weight on those manifests is an accurate representation of how much actual P waste you're generated. You want to try to keep it accurate and not add on all the packing and all the other materials, because that will very easily bump you up, and that's the first thing that a regulator or an auditor will want to look for, is to see whether or not you bumped up over that 1 kilogram threshold. You're right, for P waste, you've got a two-pronged threshold and you have to pass both of them. You have to not generate more than 2.2 pounds in a month, and you can't store more than 2.2 pounds at any time. So if at any point you are generating more than 2.2 pounds and it's showing up on a manifest, the presumption is that at some point you've stored more than 2.2 pounds for at least a period of time before you shipped it out. So you're trying very hard to keep that record. It's got to be accurate, but you're trying to keep that below 2.2 pounds if that's appropriate. What you absolutely want to do is you may call Billy and let him know, even if you can't reach Billy or Billy retires, what you absolutely want to do is make a note on the manifest and in the record that says this was as a result of a one-time lab cleanout. And most regulators will absolutely accept that and say this is a one-time abnormal spike. Don't worry about it. What you don't want is to have that show up 3 or 4 times every year, because at that point it's no longer an abnormal spike. But absolutely, if it's a one-time spike every couple of years, almost every regulator will acknowledge that that's just a one-time abnormal situation, and that will not bump you up against, put you into the higher category. But absolutely put something in the manifest so that if Billy retires and somebody else comes along, there'll still be a record of it. Or if you are out on vacation the day that the EPA or EPD comes and inspects 5 years from now, there will be some record as to what happened and why it happened. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about generator status and which category you might fall into. So now we're going to talk about management requirements and what you do with the various wastes. Now that you've decided that you have waste, now that you're trying to store them and handle them properly, what does that mean and what are you thinking about? Well, like with everything else in these regulations, there are several categories of how you store and how you handle the waste. And we're going to talk about what goes on in what are called satellite accumulation areas, which are locations right where the waste is being generated, in a lab or in a facility shop. And then we're going to spend some time talking about the central or the main accumulation area, where the waste may be consolidated and held for a while before they're shipped off campus. So we've got 2 different situations. One is in the lab or in the facility shop, right where it's being handled and generated, and the other is in the central or main location where it's being consolidated for a while. So we're going to talk first about the satellite accumulation areas. Okay, and what the regulations say is that you are allowed a special exemption from most of the regulations if you have up to 55 gallons or up to 1 quart of P-listed waste. And if you are working with quantities that are smaller than those threshold amounts, then you're allowed to treat them in a special way for a while. What you have to do is you need to make sure that the situation that you're talking about is right near where the waste is being generated. So right near the lab bench, right near the facility shop, near the motor pool, right where it's being generated. It has to be under the control of the operator. So it has to be under the control of the PI or under the control of the facilities supervisor who's managing and supervising the generation of the waste. And again, we're talking about waste here, only waste. All right? And there are certain things you have to make sure get done. It has to be in good condition. The waste containers have to be compatible. They have to be labeled appropriately, and they have to be closed. So here's a good quiz. Why do I have these two pictures up on the screen? Does anybody know? It's not immediately obvious, but why do I have the door there, and why do I have the container with the funnel?
Because you're separating the lab area with a door, so it's not continuous, and then this open container here.
Absolutely right. So the question is, why do I have the picture of the door? Because that's the common definition for what is considered to be under the control of somebody and at or near the point of generation. If there's a door that can be closed, that's generally the definition of what the space is that's considered to be appropriate for a satellite area. And you want to make sure that things are closed. In a lab in particular, it's an issue because you have to keep it closed unless you're adding or removing waste from it. Having this kind of a funnel helps an awful lot. So this is just some clarification of what the requirements are that are on the previous slide. At or near the point of generation means as close as possible, practical, taking safety considerations into account. Some EPA staff, many EPA staff, take the position that if there's a door between where it's being generated and where it's being accumulated, then that's not a valid location for the satellite accumulation area. It's not a hard and fast rule, okay, which is why I'm flagging it this way. But it's a general set of how the regulations are usually applied. Everybody should understand that these regulations were written with industry in mind 35 years ago or so. They were written with the idea that you were going to have a large factory or a large warehouse type location with an industrial process going on, and you might have 300 feet between end to end across the space. They wanted where the waste was going to be accumulated to be relatively near where the machinery was that was being used. Nobody thought about the fact that you were going to have 14 labs in a row with individual little spaces that were very crowded when they wrote these regulations. But they still apply to universities until, if and when, they change the regulations for schools. And they're talking about doing that all the time. But for now, you've got to try to apply this as best you can, and that's the commonly accepted definition for what it means to be at or near. It's not a hard and fast rule. If there's a good reason to deviate from it, such as there's no fume hood in the room, if there's a fume hood in the room next door, and it's safer to store it in the fume hood than not, then make that argument. And you probably will make a successful argument, but you absolutely want to be mindful that where possible, you're trying to keep it as close as possible to where the waste is actually being generated and used. Under the control just means that you've got to make sure that that area is supervised or in a secure area under the control of the person that's generating the waste. All right? Having it 3 doors down is not going to do it.
A key that he has access with a locked door, and also.
That can help a lot. Okay? The concept generally is you want to make sure that everybody's aware of what waste is being generated and how it's being handled, and you don't want to have several different people bringing waste together, one not knowing what the other is doing, and then you end up with waste that might be incompatible being stored together or mixed together for some reason. That's the point, fundamentally, of these regulations. Closed just means that the container can be turned on its side without leaking. All right? And you come across this a lot in labs. Things are not put on with caps at all, or the cap is put on and it's just resting on top, but it's not really tight. This is what the regulators will generally go by. It has to be able to be tipped over and not leak. Otherwise, it's not considered to be closed. So, labeling of containers. Every container has to be labeled with the words hazardous waste or with words that are going to convey the identity and the description of the contents. You are not allowed to have abbreviations or chemical formulas. Why not? Why wouldn't you want to have an abbreviation? People don't speak abbreviations. People may not know what the abbreviation is. You and I may have the same understanding, but the fire department that comes in to deal with an emergency may have a very different understanding of what that abbreviation means. And that's why we don't want to take the chance. So as much as the professor or the faculty or the research staff will say, but they know what the abbreviation stands for, the fact is not everybody knows. And the truth is that the waste will leave the lab someday. It will go into a larger main accumulation area, most likely. Everybody working in that larger main accumulation area has to have the same understanding as well. You want to avoid risks.
Or the professor leaves and nobody else understands his hieroglyphics.
That's another good reason. The professor leaves and nobody understands his or her hieroglyphics. Absolutely. Never happens. No, it happens a fair amount. So absolutely. The hazardous waste regulations don't require that. There may be other reasons why you want to have that, but the regulations under the hazardous waste rules do not require that. Okay? This is a typical example of what a hazardous waste label might look like. Okay? In terms of SAA management, when you reach the 55-gallon limit, and it's highly unlikely that you will ever reach that in a lab setting, but in a facility setting you might, within 3 days you have to move it out of the satellite accumulation area, or if you've got P-listed waste, acutely hazardous waste, if you have 1 quart, you have to move it out within 3 days of reaching the 1 quart limit. At that point, when it's ready to be picked up, then there must be a date put on it. When it hits that main accumulation area, it must have a date on it because you need to show that you are holding it for no longer than the regulated amount of time. It cannot sit in that main accumulation area for longer than a designated period of time, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But you must make sure that at that point it gets a date on it. This is just a quick example of a checklist, and you've got that in your materials. There's a quick checklist behind the PowerPoint of issues that you would want to look for, think about when you are auditing. There's a checklist for satellite accumulation areas that goes through each of the issues, and we're going to use that in a little bit when we do a mock inspection. Here's a quick picture of a satellite accumulation area. Does anybody see any problems with anything in the picture? Okay. You may have incompatible chemicals there. Yes, you might. You also might have an open container. You have abbreviations. You have a container that may not have a label on it. Okay? And this is not a staged picture. This is actually a real picture. It just happens to have a lot in it. Okay? So there are definitely issues you want to be thinking about and being looking for as you audit each different fume hood, each different satellite accumulation area, to be thinking about what you may find there. Okay? How about this? I won't focus only on labs. How about in this picture?
It is and it isn't. If the picture taken with the guy standing back waiting to dump something in there, then it's
Okay,
not.
right.
But if it's empty and you had to flip the light on, you walk in and saw that, then it is.
Okay, so yes, let's assume for a moment that nobody's in there actively pouring anything in or ready to take something out. What you have there is then you've got an open container that is just sitting there. It's nicely labeled, which is great, but it's an open container. Okay, so that's the issue that you want to be thinking about and looking for. These are some common violations. And the question came up before, do you need secondary containment for a satellite accumulation area? There is no specific requirement that says you must have secondary containment in a satellite accumulation area. But what you must do is you have to make sure that incompatible wastes are separated. And the best and the most common, easy way to do that is to have secondary containment for each different type of waste that might be incompatible with something else. Also, you need to manage those wastes in a safe and appropriate manner, which is a fairly general, vague standard. But again, most of the time what that means is put it in secondary containment, particularly if it's in a fume hood and the fume hood has a drain in it, then you want to make sure it's in secondary containment to satisfy that general requirement. So there's no specific requirement in a satellite area to have secondary containment, but there are some good reasons to meet other requirements that you generally want to have secondary containment. The fume hood itself, if it does not have a drain and it's got enough of a lip, could function as your secondary containment as long as everything is compatible. But that's a lot of ifs. So the general rule that's easiest as a best management practice is to have secondary containment. Right? Any questions about that? What to think about, what to look for? Again, in a satellite area. These are areas in a lab or in a machine shop that are right near where the waste is being generated. Yes? Again, that's under a different set of regulations. That's under SPCC regulations or under stormwater regulations. As a good practice, yes.
But they wrote, West, left, I think the wrote West Georgia up to that.
Depends on what the circumstances are. So again, the issue there very loosely would be the same, making sure that something is not going to spill or get into a drain. And so depending on the circumstances for used grease, if it's right near a drain and it looks like it may be leaking towards the drain, then you may want secondary containment. But let me hold that generally for when we talk about grease under the SPCC regulations. It's a little hard to give you a specific answer to a very general question, but as a general rule, you always want to be thinking about that. It's the right kind of question to be asking. Any other questions about satellite accumulation area before we move over to the other container area, which is the main accumulation area? So now we're going to talk a little bit about the storage area requirements. And this, by when I mean storage area, I'm talking about the central or the main accumulation area where waste is being accumulated across the campus. So what you've got is when you're ready to move waste from a satellite accumulation area, you generally are going to move it to a main or central area. You don't have to. You can arrange to have it picked up directly from the satellite area. But most of the time, you're going to accumulate it for a while first. When you do that, then you're talking about a main or a central storage area. The key things to know are that a large quantity generator has 90 days to move it once it's in that large area, that main area. A small quantity generator has 180 days to move it off-site. I keep focusing on those two time frames because that's what the requirements call for, and it's very important that you be able to show that. The easiest and best way to show that is by dating every single container from the moment it gets into that main accumulation area from the satellite area. So that's why we keep focusing a lot on dating each container once it moves. The minute it moves to that main area, you've got to be able to show that it's being held for no more than 180 days if you're a small quantity generator, no more than 90 days if you're a large quantity generator. Some storage requirements generally, whether you're large or small, you want to make sure that things are being stored in good condition, things are not being stored that are incompatible with each other. You want to make sure that the containers are compatible, that they are closed. It's a lot of the same requirements, but you absolutely want to make sure that you're meeting all these because anytime you are inspected, I can guarantee you that they will come and take a look at that main accumulation area. All right? And this is one where you do want to have secondary containment there because it's the easiest and best way to make sure that things are not going to be stored with other incompatibles. Because here, you're not just talking about one lab. You may be talking about many labs and facilities all bringing waste together, and the likelihood that things are all compatible with each other is very small. There's a much greater likelihood that things will be incompatible. And by putting them in secondary containment, then you're going to satisfy this requirement much more easily. You need to make sure that things are stored properly in a way that won't cause them to leak, and that they are labeled with the words hazardous waste, contents of the container, and that they've got accumulation start dates. The other thing you must do is you have to inspect the main accumulation area every week, and you have to keep a record of the inspections. If you have a checklist and that somebody is going in and checking that each week, then that is considered to be an inspection. The issue is that you want to make sure that the person is trained properly and that you can show that they've been trained properly. And then that would be okay. They don't have to work for the EHS department necessarily in order to do the inspections, but they do have to be trained properly and they do have to fill out the checklist. They have to keep a record of what they saw and note any deficiencies that they saw every week. A couple other requirements that you just want to make sure that you're meeting. You need to provide that adequate secondary containment for the main storage area, and you want to make sure that things are separated so that there are no incompatibles. What do you think about this situation? This is a main accumulation area.
What's that on the floor?
What's that on the floor? What's over here? This is another container.
Does it have something in it?
It has something in it, yes. I know it's a little blurry. It's not a great picture because of the flash. But this is another container, and it's just sitting on the floor. So it doesn't have secondary containment. This has secondary containment. This is good. It's closed. This is good. This does not have secondary containment. All right? So it needs to have secondary containment. All right? If the building itself, that's good. The question is that there are two types of secondary containment. The question is, what if the building itself has secondary containment? The building itself functions as secondary containment. That's good to make sure that nothing gets released to the outer environment. But if you have two types of incompatible materials, you want to make sure that those also are separated from each other. And so you want to make sure that incompatibles are in secondary containment so they don't accidentally mix together with each other within the contained area. All right, so it's not enough to have the building function as secondary containment unless you can be sure that everything in there is all compatible with each other. If you, this is never going to happen on a college campus, but in another setting, if you had one waste stream and that's all you were accumulating, you might have an argument that you don't need secondary containment within the building because everything is compatible, it's the same waste stream. But in a college campus setting, it's virtually impossible to have that come up. We're going to talk a little bit about preparedness rules. We're going to get to training and some of the other requirements that you have to be thinking about. And the reason that I'm not focusing in on conditionally exempt small quantity generators at all, if any of your campuses fall into that category, is because none of these apply. If you are a conditionally exempt small quantity generator, there's very little that applies. I've got a handout in the back in my bag that I'm going to hand out to everybody that gives you a quick cheat sheet for the different categories and what you need to be thinking about. But conditionally exempt means that aside from getting an EPA ID number, essentially all the other requirements drop away. There's very little you have to do. So that's another good reason why, if your campus is in that category, try very hard to stay in that category. All right? So in terms of preparedness, what are you thinking about? If you are either a large or a small quantity generator, bless you, somebody, you want to make sure you've appointed an emergency coordinator. You want to, this is a general duty clause, if you will. You want to minimize the possibility of a fire or an explosion. You need to have adequate aisle space. You need to make sure that you can get any equipment in there if you needed to. Again, this is a holdover really from an industrial setting where you've got many drums of 55 gallons or more that you're accumulating, but still for a laboratory setting, if you're accumulating drums of waste, you need to make sure that you have adequate aisle space. You need to make sure that there's appropriate fire suppression equipment, having a fire extinguisher or fire suppression equipment, decontamination equipment nearby. You need to make sure that you can show that you've tested the equipment periodically and that it works appropriately. You need to have immediate access to an internal alarm or an emergency communication device. Right? This is one that comes up sometimes that not everybody meets. You need to make sure that there is a telephone or a handheld two-way radio available. So you're both needing to summon help through an alarm system and being able to communicate appropriately. In a world where most of us have cell phones, this is less of an issue, but when these regulations were written 30 years ago, nobody had cell phones. You needed to have a telephone or a two-way radio there. The regulations haven't changed, but as long as you can show that everybody who's likely to go into that space is going to have a cell phone with them, then you're meeting this requirement. Otherwise, you need to make sure that there is a phone somewhere nearby. The answer is yes, you are. The fact is that we live in a world where there are multiple sets of regulations that you have to deal with, and they generally were not written with an eye towards being consistent with each other or incorporating by reference requirements from one regulatory program into another. So a lot of them impose fairly redundant requirements. You want to just make sure that you're meeting all of them and showing that you can often meet them both. You also, this is one issue that comes up a fair amount that is not always covered, you need to make an attempt to enter into a written agreement with your local emergency providers, so with the police, with the fire department, with a hospital. What you have to do, the way the regulations are written very carefully, is you have to attempt to enter into a written agreement. It's rare that you will be successful at actually having a written agreement, but what a campus has to do is make sure that they have sent a letter and have the letter on file that they've asked for arrangements with the local emergency providers. You don't have to get a response back. The letter itself is your attempt, but you have to have some documentation that you've tried to enter into an arrangement. It may be just a presumption automatically, of course the police are going to come, of course the fire department's going to come, of course the hospital is going to accept anybody who's injured, but the regulations call for you attempting to make those regulations, the requirement, and put it in paper, document it, put it down on paper. So make sure that you've got that letter on file somewhere. That satisfies this requirement. Absolutely. The issue is that most of us presume that, of course, this is something that's going to happen no matter what. Just document it so that you've met the requirements in the regulation. A couple of requirements that are applicable only for large quantity generators that are an additional burden that's placed on them. You need to make sure that you are preventing unknown or unauthorized access to the storage facility. You need to make sure that you've posted the appropriate sign and that it's visible from at least 25 feet away. You need to make sure that any place you're storing ignitable or reactive waste is at least 50 feet from your property line. Most likely never going to be an issue at a college campus, but still, just to know what the regulations call for. And you need to make sure that the storage facility is appropriately vented and that it meets all the other requirements for air emissions that are set out in the regulations. Just like with the satellite accumulation area, we've got a checklist in the materials for 90-day storage areas and another one for 180-day storage areas. So in the materials that you've got behind the PowerPoint, behind the standard auditing procedure, you've got checklists for all three situations. All right, you need to have a contingency plan. What's a contingency plan? Anybody know?
What if?
What if? What if something happens? What are you going to do? So for a large quantity generator only, you must have a contingency plan that walks through what to happen, where you're going to go to make sure that you've got the appropriate responses, who to call, what to do. All right? And there's a checklist for that too, just in case. If you're auditing a campus that's a large quantity generator, this is what you want to be thinking about. All right, last little section. What to think about if you're going to be auditing and you want to think about how containers are being managed. Has it been there more than 90 days or 180 days? Have you had inspections done? Have you noted noncompliance on the inspections? Do you have the appropriate equipment? Is there a communication device? These are just things to check for and to think about. Well, you don't have to have a contingency plan just for the event of a flood, but if you were required, if you were a large quantity generator, I don't know that you would be, only if you are a large quantity generator do you have to have a contingency plan at all, for anything. If you were a large quantity generator, then you'd have to reasonably anticipate likely events like a flood, especially in your location. But if you are not a large quantity generator, then for purposes of RCRA, that requirement drops away. There may be other regulations that call for that, but for purposes of RCRA, that regulation drops away. Okay, so you're right, the answer is no. All right, we're almost done. I know this has been a long, long, long session. I know there's a lot to do, but we're almost done. Almost done, so hang in there, just a few more minutes. In terms of packing requirements, this is more for general information than anything else. Everything that leaves a campus that is a hazardous waste must meet the Department of Transportation requirements, which I'm not going to go into, but loosely they just mean it has to be packed safely, it has to be labeled properly, it has to be handled properly in an appropriate kind of vehicle. Everything has to be marked in accordance with both the Department of Transportation and RCRA requirements. What is important is that for a large and small quantity generator, you have a manifest, a shipping record for every waste shipment that leaves the campus. Conditionally exempt small quantity generators don't have to worry about this. But if you are a larger small quantity generator, you must have a manifest for every shipment. You have to use a licensed waste transporter. Conditionally exempt small quantity generators aren't required to do that. Okay? They can use anybody they want, they can ship it themselves, they can bring it to somebody else. But if you are a smaller or large quantity generator, you must use a manifest and you must use a licensed waste transporter. This is a quick example of what a manifest looks like. There used to be one for every single state. About 2 years ago, the EPA adopted one uniform standard. This is just another place where you can get some additional information on that. At this point, they've been in use long enough that hopefully everybody in this room and everywhere else is using only the new uniform hazardous waste manifests. A whole bunch of things that need to show up on each manifest. There's a whole bunch of information that needs to go in there. And when we were talking much earlier today about all those waste codes for the different types of wastes, this is where they show up. So you need to show your EPA identification number. You need to have one for the campus, one for the transporter. You need to have a description of the waste. You need to have the amount and the weight of the waste. This is where the issue of P-listed waste comes up, and sometimes where campuses can get in trouble because it's listed incorrectly as too much. You need to have that waste code for each waste. You need to have the material code for the DOT waste. You need to make sure you've acknowledged anything that exceeds a regulated quantity. You need to make sure that the manifest has been signed and the name is printed. What's important here with the signature is that only people who've been trained properly are authorized to sign manifests. This is an issue that comes up a fair amount. You need to make sure that anyone who's signing has the proper training, and we're going to get to training requirements in just a minute. This is another place where you need to make sure that everybody is trained properly. You need to make sure that if it's appropriate, you've got the appropriate land disposal restrictions, and we'll get to that in a minute too. You need to make sure that those shipments are going out frequently enough that you're meeting those deadlines for not holding the waste longer than you're supposed to. Again, only someone who's been trained and authorized may sign that manifest. You need to keep a copy of that manifest for at least 3 years. So when we audit, we're going to look for 3 years' worth of manifests. That's what an EPA inspector or an EPD inspector would typically look for. So you've sent out your waste. You've gotten rid of it. Congratulations, you're all done, right? No, you're not all done. Unfortunately not. No. You need to make sure you get a copy of that waste shipment manifest back within 35 days if you are a large quantity generator. Right? You need to get it back. If you don't get it back in that time period, you have 10 days to try to contact the shipper, the facility where it ended up, and get a copy of it. If not, you're supposed to file an exception report with Georgia EPD. This is a cradle-to-grave set of regulations, meaning from the moment the waste is generated all the way through the final disposal of it, somebody is responsible for it. The way you close that loop under the regulations is that you, as the generator, campus, are the only person who really knows that that shipment went out. If you don't get confirmation back, then you're supposed to notify EPD so that they can look into it. This is to safeguard against the unlikely event that somebody is taking that waste and dumping it on the side of the road somewhere. All right? It's not likely to happen, but that's the requirement, so you want to make sure that you follow up. And you've got a similar requirement. If you're a small quantity generator, you just have 60 days to do it. However, the Board of Regents has decided that to make life a little simpler, everybody, whether you're a large or small quantity generator, has to live with the 35-day rule. So the regulations give the small quantity generator 60 days. But the Board of Regents has decided that under policy, all campuses in Georgia that are under the system that are small or large quantity generators, have to make sure that they get their manifest back within 35 days or follow up and check on it. A couple of quick audit tips in terms of looking to see what you're checking for if you're auditing on the manifest area. You want to make sure that you've got the appropriate RQ that's listed. You want to make sure that the manifests are signed and printed properly. The full name of the person. Make sure that the P listed waste is not overstated. Or if it is, that there's a comment section that explains that it was overpacked. You want to make sure that the appropriate time period between the shipment and the receipt date, meaning that 35-day period, that there is an appropriate land disposal restriction attached if appropriate, and that the transporter ID number and also the generator ID number is appropriate and listed on each manifest. Basically, for training requirements, if you're a large quantity generator, you must make sure that you've really adequately gotten trained in how to handle and manifest hazardous waste. If you're going to be signing those manifests, you have to go through appropriate training. If you are, you've got to make sure that you're familiar with the different requirements and how to make sure that things are done properly. And this is, you've got to document all this. You've got to make sure that the training is being handled and done by a person who is appropriate to deliver the training. You've got to document it properly, and you have to document several other things as well, including a job description. For, again, this is only for large quantity generators. If you are a small quantity generator, and I have a cheat sheet I'm going to hand to you, you want to make sure that you've got just the words in the regulation are appropriate training to make sure that a person is being protective and adequately aware of what their requirements are. So it's a much looser standard. You don't need a job description, but you just want to make sure that anyone who's signing a manifest can document that they've been adequately trained to understand what they're signing and why they're signing it. There is a requirement for a biennial report. You have some record keeping that you need to keep for each of the two types of campuses.
Get that 3 years. Never get rid of these things.
Yes, good question. By regulation, should you keep this for the 3-year period? That's what the regulations call for. Best management practices, you keep manifests forever. Does anybody know why?
Yes, twice.
No,
Say,
it's-
cradle to grave, you send this out to the TSDF, and then at the TSDF, they become a Superfund site.
Mhm.
So blank, 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 blank law firm is gonna send you a letter asking you to participate in a
Exactly
blank
right.
check cleanup.
Yes.
And if you don't have the records to send back to them saying, we tested this stuff, thank you for
Right.
asking, but we choose not to participate, you will participate in it.
Yes.
And then send a letter back to them saying, Psycho retired, it's gone.
Right.
No,
Right. The biggest reason is that if someday you get pulled into a Superfund
Yeah.
case, the best way you can show that you should not be there is by keeping your manifest and being able to say, no, my waste didn't go to that landfill or that location, it went over here. And that may be 10 or 20 years from now. Other sections in this talk about your record keeping, and we talked about that briefly. Land disposal restrictions, I'm not going to go into any detail. Just know that you are required to show that hazardous waste that is being shipped out that may be disposed of in a landfill, you are required to show that it is safe to dispose of in a landfill, an appropriately lined, designated hazardous waste landfill. But still, there's a set of requirements that have to be done to show that. So there is an accompanying document called the Land Disposal Restriction Document that needs to be completed to show that it's appropriate, if it's being sent to a landfill, that it's safe to do that. So that's another record that a campus wants to have and that an auditor wants to look for. And there's a brief explanation as to what that is. And then at the very end, there is a brief explanation for what it means to be a licensed, why you need a hazardous waste license. And the key is everybody needs a hazardous waste license, except if you're a large quantity generator and you store it for less than 90 days. You're a small quantity generator and you store for less than 180 days. That's why we keep focusing on those two deadlines and making them so important. Because otherwise, if you don't meet those, officially the EPA can say that you are a TSDF and that you need to meet all the requirements of a TSDF, and you don't want to have to do that. So you want to make sure that you stay within those limits in order to do that.